Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm your moderator, Corey Glaze. I'm a project manager at IT Communications Office here at IU. Today's webinar is titled Effective Cybersecurity for Research. We also want to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel at a later date. We encourage you to use the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll be checking periodically throughout the whole presentation. But we may wait until the end to answer. Our host for today's webinar is ResearchSoc. ResearchSoc is a package of services from Indiana University's OmniSoc, tailored to meet the unique cybersecurity needs of NSF research facilities. ResearchSoc combines OmniSoc's 24/7 monitoring, vulnerability identifications, decoy computers, dedicated project expertise, and other services to make NSF facilities resilient to cyber attacks and capabilities of supporting trustworthy, productive research. Today's presenter, Anurag Shankar. Anurag is a senior security analyst at Indiana University's Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research, or CACR. His expertise includes regulatory compliance and cybersecurity risk management. He has helped numerous institutions tackle HIPAA compliance and is responsible for developing a NIST-based risk framework and using it to align IU cybersecurity research cyber infrastructure with HIPAA. He's also the manager of Secure My Research at CACR. And with that, Anurag, feel free to take it away.
Okay, thanks, Corey, and welcome to you all. It's nice to see so many of you here, and I think I'm going to start sharing my screen here in a second. Is that visible? Can you see it?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. All right. Again, welcome. This was to be a co-presentation with my co-conspirator, Will Drake, who is sort of the primary implementer of some of the stuff I'm going to talk about. But unfortunately, he got COVID, and so he will not be able to join me, and I will try my best to cover his parts of the presentation. And the idea is to keep it about 45 minutes, so there's time for questions. This is basically an overview of a paper that we recently released, which is called Effective Cybersecurity for Research. And the URL for that paper is down here. I think it was also part of the announcement. And if you read the paper, then you will basically get a summary of that paper, a short paper, but with the opportunity to ask questions. And so what I'm going to do in this presentation is to, as I said, do an overview of the paper, and so start with a very brief introduction. Then I'll talk a little bit about where this whole idea and approach actually comes from. Talk a little bit about what we call fundamentals of research cybersecurity. And then the main section actually in the paper is about how to implement research cybersecurity. And it actually is describing our implementation of that here at IU. But the paper presents it as a guide for people who might be interested in using the guidance to implement it at their institution. And needless to say that our implementation was not quite as neat and clean. And then I will close with a few conclusions. So I don't think I need to say this, but securing research is a huge challenge on campuses. The research is kind of amorphous. It doesn't lend itself to be treated in a sort of a uniform way. And researchers are kind of special people doing special things. And there are other things that are associated with it which make it challenging. For example, researchers work with regulated data, and meeting those regulations compliance requirements is difficult. And basically with the current cyber climate, the number of regulations is increasing and becoming actually more extreme. Also, with time, new threats are emerging, and so it's hard to interpret, to anticipate and tackle those threats. And in the same line, there are certain things which are unique to research. I think so far our attempts at securing research have been directed at securing basically the confidentiality. So in other words, it's very much a compliance-based approach. But I think we also need to worry about protecting the efficiency, trustworthiness, and reproducibility of research, because that's a kind of a big thing. Making sure that the institution is delivering something that can actually be trusted by the public. So talking about the origins, this actually goes back quite a bit, almost 25 years at this point. We got a big grant and we're asked to deliver high-performance computing services to the School of Medicine. Prior to this, there was no presence of research computing out there. People had local IT support and desktops and that sort of stuff, and department servers. And while we were putting this together, HIPAA intervened, and of course it was promulgated in 1996. But the HIPAA security rule, which is what deals with IT, was had to be implemented by 2005, and that sort of complicated thing. So what we ended up doing was we aligned our HPC cyber infrastructure with HIPAA. Again, this was a time when no one really knew much about it. My expectation was I could go to some other campuses and get the recipe for doing this, but there weren't any other campuses. So I had to come up with this myself. And once this was done, then kind of assuming that those researchers in the School of Medicine were like all our usual suspects, engineers, engineering faculty, and physical scientists, we expected them to just simply adopt these systems and also secure and comply with those regulations, with HIPAA regulation. What we actually found was that clinical researchers, as I call, did not speak HPC. So the terms that we were using in our campaigns were really not understood by them, and the campaign was pretty much a failure, and didn't produce very many customers. And of course, the other thing, which is probably true for most researchers, was that they were focused entirely on getting research done and actually had no interest in learning security and compliance. I think the doctors are probably an extreme example of this. This is probably true again also for many researchers. So where it led ultimately was first to the realization that our initial expectations and our approach was simply completely off base. This sort of top-down or the traditional approach to cybersecurity research was not going to work. And so what we started to do was to, instead of saying, here's a bunch of services you can use, to essentially engaging with them one-on-one and asking, what is it you're trying to accomplish? And then taking these systems we had made compliant and other resources and sort of stringing them together to what I call baking security into the researchers' workflow so that they could accomplish those goals. So we kind of stayed with them through the process. And then very ultimately, almost 20 years down the road, 2020 to 2005 to 2022, we implemented a program. We call it Secure My Research, and it's a service, and it basically incorporates the lessons learned and all the rest of it that is in the papers, basically. And what I'm going to talk about actually is just the product of this. So because we knew that we had to do a completely different way of, or we had to approach cybersecurity in a completely different way. We wanted to sort of redefine it, and we wanted to call it research cybersecurity, basically, as a formal term. And not only that, but we also had to make it very researcher-centric. So this had to be, we had to think of all this from the researcher's perspective, because we weren't doing that before, and that wasn't working. And so the way we define that is in terms of something that accelerates research and deals with risk and all that, but its primary function actually is to accelerate research. And in order to do so, you have to understand the research and the role it plays in the institution, and also researchers, obviously, the people who conduct that research. So what we call certain research fundamentals have to be internalized. First one is that research is the mission, not cybersecurity. And so therefore, cybersecurity's mission is to enable, sustain, and accelerate that research. The second one is that the cybersecurity has to account for the unique nature of research. I was a researcher for a long time. I'm a computational astrophysicist by training. And I can tell you that, that things are fairly chaotic and not undisciplined. And there's a lot of time wasted, but that's where ideas are born, and that's where the innovation occurs. And therefore, this has to be understood by us that are trying to secure research and basically apply a sort of similarly innovative approach to securing research. The third one is particularly important. That is that the research life cycle is very challenging for the researchers. Researchers basically have to establish themselves, and they have to get funding because they're not doing research alone. They're doing tens of other things at the same time, and other people are competing against them. And therefore, they have extreme pressures on being successful. In order to be successful, they have to withstand these pressures. And the last one is, in order to actually get research done successfully, and is to understand that speed is of the essence, and the work has to be done within an indicated time. Especially grants are time limited. There are other there's competition, and they're working probably feverishly. You may have more graduate students than you, and so it's very important to understand and appreciate that researchers do not have time, but still have to work furiously to get their work done. We also sort of came up with what we call these 10 research cybersecurity principles. And I will go, again, the details are in the paper, but I think I'll just go into it very briefly, each of them. The first one I've already mentioned, that the first principle is that you must focus on accelerating research. So focus on research, basically. The second one is if you're going to apply cybersecurity research, then I think it will work best if you make it invisible to the researcher. And I'll talk more about that. The third one is, again, if you understand the research life cycle and internalize that, then I think you really need to understand that you have to empathize with the researcher in order to be effective. Researchers can very quickly see that can quickly detect your attitude. So that's the fourth one. Often there's the attitude that the researcher is the weak link in the chain, and I completely disagree with that. I think the reason the researchers or anyone else uses insecure things is because the institution is not providing the right tools and the right support to do the things securely. The fifth one I don't have to actually go through. It really is all about relationships. It's all about human connections. The sixth one is important. I think researchers have a sort of negative perception of cybersecurity, something that slows them down. And that's generally the sort of the doomsday approach that we take with cybersecurity. And so I think it's very important to create a positive perception. So you only present cybersecurity in a positive light. It is something that accelerates research. And if you think about it, that's what it's actually doing by protecting them and protecting their data and not, making sure they can work at speed. So this is done by messaging. Messaging has to be positive. Number 8, I think I've stated, speed is the single most important goal of research cybersecurity, to basically get whatever researchers need done at the speed that they need to do it at. Number 9, the traditional approach has been to essentially, provide systems which are secure and leave the rest to the researchers. And what we need really to do is to understand what the researchers are doing in some detail, and then staying with them and basically securing the entire research workflow or workflows that they have. Number 10 is slightly unusual, perhaps. I think of research risk acceptance actually as a control. It's the most important control, as a matter of fact, because the biggest risk to research is that the research does not get done. And therefore, often in order to make sure the research gets done, you have to accept risk at the cost of cybersecurity. And that is just how it's going to be. So you have to use it as kind of a control sometimes. So again, so the main part of this is the implementation. And again, as I said, I'm going to be describing how we did it here. And so there are like 9 steps to it, and I'm going to briefly go through each one of them, starting with obviously determining what you need, basically how much money it takes to do this. And that would be people, technology, training, other sorts of things. And in the paper, there's details, but we sort of estimate a cost based on size and other things. But for R1 at IU here, for example, we figured it takes 2 FTEs, and basically at this point, having done it for 2 years, can vouch for that. So that's like 500,000 a year, and of course scales down for smaller campuses. Again, read the paper for details. And of course, this can be all offset by leveraging existing resources, repurposing them, which we also did. You have to have dedicated personnel to do this properly. And so you have to have someone lead this research cybersecurity program or build it, and then have people that will actually help the researchers. The problem right now is that there are really not that many people that are really qualified, and they don't completely understand what's involved in providing research cybersecurity. So this is something we have to, these are people that we have to grow going forward. However, the paper talks about the kinds of people that would be probably ideal. The leader probably should have some sort of grounding in research, at least understanding research. It helps a lot if the person is a researcher, and primarily because it allows you to have that connection with the researchers. And also it gives the researcher that perception that it's someone that's looking out for them, and it's not the security office coming after them. So that separating it from governance is actually kind of important. We found that by experience. You have to provide research cybersecurity training. Obviously, these people probably have to have some cybersecurity training. So we are training someone here who didn't have a lot of cybersecurity training, but is coming up to speed quite well, had some research experience. And so they have to be versed in these research fundamentals I talked about, the principle, and also the implementation guidance that's in the paper. So I think these are sort of the minimum things that they need to have. The next step is to do the homework. You have to do your homework in all of these things. And the first, probably the most important one, is to identify all the stakeholders. And this is not just the researchers, but everyone on campus that also supports research. And this is a big list, and the paper has attempts to be fairly exhaustive. But some I will mention, for example, the sponsored research office, the IRB, research compliance, and even human resources and so forth. You have to know who they are, and then basically find out what they do exactly and establish relationships with them, have meetings with them. And this, we point out that points of origin are most important. So where researchers go, sort of start with. So that would be sponsored research, for example, central IT, research computing, and places like that, to catch the researchers there and bring these stakeholders sort of into the fold. One thing that's very important is that providing research cybersecurity requires all stakeholders to work together. It's very difficult to do it otherwise. The third one is, in order to be able to provide support to the researchers, you have to understand all the policies and procedures that apply to research. And that would be, of course, IT policies, security, privacy, compliance, and so forth. And this is important for multiple purposes, but certainly that's one of them. You have to understand what researchers are doing. These are some of the more important things. I think we have done a slightly different approach, and this is what we've tried to illustrate in the paper. The paper was to be a 4-page paper, sort of summary paper. When we started to write it down, we realized that these are things that were kind of useful that we had done. And so we sort of break then these things down into what we call use cases and workflows. So use cases are things that people do, or researchers are doing in order to get something done, some action. The example we give is, for example, to share data with internal and external researchers. So that would be a use case. And the workflow is the steps that they would have to go through in order to get that sort of, fulfill that use case. And so in the sharing case, it would be, obviously getting an account in the sharing service and then setting permissions and so forth. And it's difficult to actually come up with these use cases, but fortunately, because I've been doing it for 25 years, I've been collecting these things. And if you go to this cookbook, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, you will see about 100 of them. Of course, once you have, in order to provide the research cybersecurity service, you have to understand what solutions exist that can be recommended to the researchers. So that would be general research, IT support, specialized services, and again, these are enumerated in the paper. And then once you know what researchers are doing, and then what solutions the institution is providing, you can figure out what they need, because what they need are things that we're not providing. So these are resources that are needed to support those workflows. And the last step is to assess and mitigate risk to research. And by that I mean, if those needs are unmet, then researchers are going to go do whatever they need to do to get the research done, in many cases insecurely. So if, for example, there's not a data sharing service with external providers, external collaborators, then they might go use a public service to share sensitive data, for example. So that's one source of that risk, and the other one is what I call insecure workflows. This has multiple sort of sources, but one of them is the misunderstanding of the controls that researchers might have. An example that we provide in here is encryption, and this happened to us at least a couple of times, which was that the researcher, for example, was told that their disk was encrypted on their desktop, so they thought that the data would be encrypted, and they put it out there in some public place, thinking it remains encrypted because it's encrypted on their disk. And so these are things that are difficult to foresee, but with time you can sort of create an inventory of these things as well. So once you have an idea about what solutions you need in order to address all these use cases and workflows, then you develop those solutions if you don't have them. Sometimes you have the solutions, but maybe they're not appropriately secure. For example, if you have to provide compliance, and so you take the existing solutions and basically inject those controls into them, or basically get new systems, either on-prem and often in the cloud these days, because many of the cloud services have fairly high-end compliance regimes. They meet with compliance, strict compliance regimes. And then the last step in our way of thinking is it's not enough to simply have these systems and services. You actually have to think about those use cases and map these resources into to those workflows, basically, create workflows. And again, the cookbook will show this, where if someone wants to do X, then you take system, A, B, C, D in a certain way and combine them to actually secure that workflow that would accomplish that use case. With all this kind of homework done, to actually provide the help that researchers need, you have to establish a service, and that's what we have. It's called, that we call Secure My Research. And I mentioned this earlier, the service should be something that's voluntary. If it's perceived as being shoved down, one's throat, then that's not going to be successful. Not that we tried to do this, but again, having done this for a long time, I've seen that many times. And even with Secure My Research, sometimes we went out and the researchers had the perception that we were coming in, we were the security office, and that was problematic. So the service is best actually provided out of someplace other than that. And that's why I said a front end could be a researcher. That would be very useful. The second one is researchers don't have long memory. They don't remember many things. So it's best to choose a single name for the service, and that's all they need to remember. And you tell them that if you have a security and compliance issue, you simply remember this one word and you come to it, we'll take care of you. That's how we do Secure My Research, and that's the term that we use. we have only two things that researchers have to remember: securemyresearch.iu.edu and securemyresearch@iu.edu. The third thing, obviously, is based on, this will all depend on campus, but you have to determine what kinds of help you are going to be able to provide. In our case, what we have done is to say, any cybersecurity compliance issue, people can come to us, we will take care of it. We may not be the ones that will provide the final solution to it, but we will be the one-stop shop that will go find whatever needs to be found. And so we, for example, we would do custom solutions. If they come to us, we certainly identify existing solutions. If they say, okay, this has to be HIPAA compliant, what does that mean in my context? We'll do that. Provide assessments and boilerplates if they're using central systems. The service that we provide has three components, and again, we recommend that's how it should be implemented. One is consulting, self-service, and advocacy. By consulting, it means what you think it means. It's just one-on-one help to researchers. However, we have learned many nuances. There are many nuances involved in being successful, and I sort of enumerate that in the paper. But probably the most important is that this consulting has to take into account that speed factor. So the responses have to be instant. So, for example, when we get a ticket, there's an instant response by a person which says, "Oh, can we meet today or tomorrow, and we can talk about this thing." And that has a couple of purposes. One is that we found that in many cases we're able to resolve that issue during that meeting. Therefore, we can do it today or tomorrow. In other cases, it might take a little more work. But the other purpose of this is to establish those relationships. So while we're talking with them, we ask them what they're doing, and then sort of proselytize, talk about what we can do for them. And this has pretty much made sure that they come back to us again, the return customers. And of course, we take all the information about these researchers, put them in a database, and use it when it serves us. When we go back to them again, or they come back to us again, we remember who they were, what they were doing, and that's very useful to have. Consulting is what most researchers actually prefer, but it's not the most efficient way in some cases. An online resource can be provided that can provide them the answer very much more quickly. And so we have something called a cookbook. And the cookbook we have implemented as a knowledge base. And sort of the clever thing about that is that it hides security into plain view. So for example, here's the cookbook. You type in a keyword, and what comes back are use cases. So for example, if you said share, you say share data, use case I've been talking about, and then there are step-by-step directions. And this is what essentially addresses the, okay, tell us what to do. So you just follow those steps, and you're compliant and secure, and so forth. And if that's not good enough, then you come to us. Email securemyresearch@iu.edu. The third piece is advocacy, and that is researchers are often at odds with policies and procedures, or they have needs which are not being met. And so when we are out there talking with them, we learn all these things and bring that back to the management. Sometimes we do preemptive sort of advocacy, by which I mean, for example, there was a need for transcription services, and we didn't really have an institutional solution for that. So we went out, found something, and actually got that through our third-party assessment process. So that's an important piece of the service. Of course, we talked about the voluntary nature of the service, but of course, that's not how things actually work. It's very hard to penetrate the world of researchers, and so therefore, what you need to do is to establish institutional workflows so that these researchers can be funneled to the service, and that means all of those stakeholders that you establish relationships with basically then become your allies. Sponsored research, for example, if they get, in our case, if they get a contract which has, for example, DoD CUI terms, and the researchers are sent to us, and we basically take care of them holistically at that point. We basically, yeah, we just learn what they're doing, and same thing with all of these other people. When researchers come to us, they learn about this, and there's a security compliance issue, they will send them to us. then once this is all in place, then you have to launch the service, and it's useful to pilot the service. We did that with a certain sort of hardy sort of group of researchers and all the stakeholders that we have involved, and there's quite a few of them. And that was very useful because that sort of worked the kinks out of the service initially. And then when we did the launch, it was a massive launch. And as I said, messaging was very important. It had nothing to do with protecting data and things like it. It was all about accelerating research and making sure that you can do your work. So that's a very important piece of it. And again, in the last couple of years that we have done this, that actually we've gotten feedback on that as well. So this is a very important aspect of this. And the third one, of course, was the use. Because we established those relationships with all those stakeholders, we used every resource they had to essentially provide this, launch this, do the launch and have the campaign spread the message through those things. We went to the radio station, things like that. We came up with some things on our own as well. And this we did, and we didn't really necessarily expect this to work very well because it was really a pilot initially, but it has worked very well, as I will show you in a second. But once the program is in place, it has to, of course, be maintained and refined as you go forward. And in doing that, that consultancy image is very, very important, so that it has to be preserved. Of course, we are plugged into governance in the back, but those are not visible to the researchers. They don't see us as being part of governance. We simply help them get their stuff done. So that's an important thing. And we've added more things. For example, we have a third-party assessment process, which probably, like most places, is very slow and doesn't work very well for research. And therefore, when we've done a pilot with the IRB, if the IRB gets a protocol that has a third-party software, for example, or system that researchers are using, instead of going through the institutional third-party process, it actually comes to us, and we go out and talk to the vendor, for example, or we go to their website and usually solve these things often in minutes or day or so. So therefore, you can imagine the acceleration of research in that case is just crazy. You have to keep up with what's going on campus, and so that means you have to stay in touch with the stakeholders and understand what the departments are doing, dean and so forth, IT service, new services, new use cases. And a lot of that happens in these interactions themselves, but you have to make explicit effort. And again, the refinement of the program often just simply happens as part of the service, but also you have to solicit feedback. So in the engagements we have, as I said, we prefer to talk to the researcher. We solicit their feedback in those things about how this accelerated their research, what they have done, and because these provide us with metrics, and do surveys. As I mentioned, compliance is a big piece of it, and I will mention that we have gone beyond that, but compliance is what has driven all this, still continues to drive that. And so if you're starting out, of course, you have to understand all the compliance regimes that are relevant to the campus, and you would probably get that very easily from sponsored research, for example. And then the way we do it is basically we do security non-compliance, and by which I mean we align our systems with a standard, which in our case is the NIST Risk Management Framework 853. That way we do security once and compliance often by mapping, for example, compliance, whatever compliance regime it is, to the standard. And good example is that the government, having done this mapping for us in NIST 800-66, which maps HIPAA to NIST. And so when these tickets come to us and there's a compliance issue, it is no different from anything else. It's simply we go in there and we will work with the researcher until compliance is baked into whatever they're doing. Of course, very important to make sure that the program is visible to all the stakeholders, most importantly, perhaps to the management. And so therefore you have to solicit these testimonials from researchers who are especially appreciative. And these have been very, very useful when asking for new funding, for example, and then of course for metrics, but also researchers. I mean, there are new researchers and indeed by establishing relationships sort of on an ongoing basis, we're getting those repeat customers, but there are new ones. By the way, the survey is actually spread by word of mouth. One researcher talking to another researcher. These campaigns are useful, but that's not where this is happening. And so therefore, these engagements that we do and the relationships are where this stuff actually happens. And of course, the last one is the stakeholders that are also engaged with you in supporting research. And so quarterly meetings with these folks to find out if there's any new problems they're having, or how well, for example, their involvement in this process is doing, and so forth. And it's actually very productive, and it's helpful on sort of bilaterally. So this all sounds very, very good. And the question is, does this work? And that's one of the things we said in our abstract, and is that this has produced measurable success, and against really expectations, at least my expectations. And I did not expect this to be adopted as quickly as it did in a single year, despite the pandemic, because the plan was to go out to faculty offices and to people, talk to people face to face, which is a strategy we have used in the past. But somehow this thing just went out, and people started to come to us, or they were sent to us also. And we completed over 200 engagements, and that doesn't sound like a big number, but it actually is. These are substantial engagements, and facilitated over $230 million in sponsored research. It's a fairly substantial number. The most amazing thing to me was that we were able to reach 25% of all faculty in 70% of all departments. And that still is kind of somewhat unbelievable to me, but there clearly is this need out there. And again, once the researchers have had sort of a taste of it, we've been invited to faculty meetings and other IT groups and so forth to provide, give presentations, and it's has been kind of a virtuous circle, so to speak. The last thing is very something that's important to me. Again, we started with compliance again. It was all HIPAA and some of these DoD type things, but it has grown way beyond that. We actually now we are plugged into these large support centers, and one of the largest is the Social Sciences Support Center, and it supports many social sciences departments, and we are kind of part of their workflow. Whenever there's an issue with security and compliance, they basically engage us. And obviously, most of these are not compliance issues or sensitive data issues. These are other security issues. That's very, very nice to see. The most interesting thing was, and I think I give an example in the paper, was with this climate researcher that has taken some data and published some results from it, and the data is on their server under their desk, and someone hacks in and changes the data to blame the researcher for faking their data, that sort of stuff. And so I gave this example in the faculty meeting at the Department of Earth and Climate Sciences, and indeed the next day I got a ticket saying, "Can you help us with preserving data integrity for data inception to disposal?" So yeah, this is actually gone beyond that initial confidentiality kind of a situation. So I'm going to stop. Actually, I'm doing quite well on time, I see. So I think the conclusions are that, first of all, that research cybersecurity actually is possible. It can be done. It does take some effort, but it can be effective, and it can be done. It does require a different approach. The top-down approach is not going to work. It has to be very researcher-centric. And again, having done this now for a while, we can see that this really is successful. It works. And so to do this, of course, as I said, that there's nuances. You have to make sure that you are always in sync with those speed requirements and so forth. So those are important things to keep in mind. And we're learning all the time, obviously, in that respect. when we do these engagements, researchers come to us and we learn something we didn't learn, we didn't know before. And again, from my perspective, this whole idea was kind of my brainchild, but I didn't necessarily implement it. Will actually was the main implementer of this. But since I've done this for a long time and have a research background, I think this actually is a completely different area, and it needs its own sort of, dedicated people, and they need to be trained. They need to understand all this stuff. They need to have some sort of research background, or at least, some idea of what this world is all about. And I think we need to grow such people, and that's what I've done in the last couple of years. We have one person that has come up to speed. I have another person coming up to speed, and there's other people here that seem to be interested. And some of them are actually, for example, graduate students that became IT people, and they seem to find this to be a very attractive area. So that's a potential place to go look for such people when you're hiring hiring for these positions or building a program. And I think I'm just going to stop there. 3 minutes early, but I will stop there and basically open the floor to questions.
Thanks, Anurag. Yeah, we have a few in here. And feel free to, just a reminder, if you have any extra questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A function and we'll get to them. But the first one here looks to be, what recourse do researchers have to third-party labs that provide software through unsecured websites?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing I should probably have mentioned in the beginning is that this program is not mandatory. So therefore, what I've said doesn't mean that we have completely secured research. A lot of researchers are doing exactly what they have done before. This whole thing is about addressing risk to the institution. And so I think we have minimized risk, or we're trying to minimize risk, but researchers are still doing what they want to do, and we can't always catch them. But as I said, when an external software is involved, we are trying by our effort to kind of anticipate what these needs are, and in helping the researcher with this thing, we would get involved and actually talk to the vendor to find out if they're secure. We've done that a number of times, and this is outside of this IRB workflow that I talked about. But other than that, there's the standard third-party assessment process, which again, they ask vendors for HECVAT and so forth. Sometimes it goes well, sometimes not. So things are not perfect. But I think we have been able to help several researchers with accelerate their workflow by getting involved in that aspect of it as well.
Great. And the next one we have here is, how was program development or startup financed, and how is the maintenance of the program financed now?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Of course, this is something that I've been proposing for a long time without any financing. I think what ultimately financed it was the presence of or the emergence of DoD compliance. So compliance is always still a kind of a motivator here. But once it became clear that we will have to deal with DoD compliance regime, CMMC, and DFARS, then I think the things I've been proposing sort of started making sense, and the pilot was funded these 2 FTEs. And so we are still actually using this. This was funded for 4 years. So 2 FTEs for 4 years is what we are still using, those funds. And so we have another couple of years to go. But what we have done is to save as much of that money as possible by essentially putting ourselves in other grants and so forth. But I think our metrics are good enough. And as I said, because of that maintenance piece of it, where we go out and make sure that the vice president for research actually knows what we're doing. So the first thing I did, obviously, was send him a copy of the paper, which interestingly, he responded to me immediately saying that he was going to be presenting something at the National Academy that he could use it for. So I think those sort of connections and keeping that in is going to ensure that funding. One thing it says in the paper, I haven't mentioned it here, is that And many of these kinds of issues that researchers come to us are actually very quickly resolved. There are those sticky issues, okay, we have to do DFARS compliance or something like that, but by and large, most of the issues, I'd say 60 to 80% of them are things we can resolve fairly quickly, either in the same meeting or in a day or two, or perhaps a week. And so the estimates we had the fear that 2 FTs was simply not going to cut it once we have thousands of researchers coming to us. And of course, first of all, there are not thousands of researchers. There may be maybe a few thousand, I guess, and not all of them are coming to us. But I think by virtue of the fact that most of the issues they have can be addressed easily, a lot of the issues have to do with the fact that they don't have institutional knowledge about what is possible or what they can do. And so when they come to us, because we have those relationships with stakeholders and we know those things, often it's a simple matter of either getting information from someone else or just we being able to provide that information. So the amount of funding, I believe at this point, that we thought it would take actually is not what it actually would take. Depends on campus, obviously, but I think it's a fair statement to make.
And you kind of mentioned this a little bit. Do the FTEs for cybersecurity need to be separate from the IT research advocates?
Not necessarily. No, I don't think so. I think the people who are doing operational cybersecurity, perhaps they should be separate, unless there's a way that you can basically take them and have them provide that other service as well. Again, it's a matter of perception. I think it depends on whether there is that tension between institutional sort of, the security office and the researchers. I think certainly most of the places I've seen there is that tension, including here as well. So I think that presents problems, but I think it's not an unsolvable problem. You could have someone that's shared, for example, between the two. What is important is the perception that the organization that is providing this service is not the security office, or at least not perceived to be the security office or a governance body. It's just someone, maybe it's, like I said, it's a research organization. So in our case, for example, this service is provided out of the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research. As I mentioned in the paper, the fact the word research is in there actually is quite helpful. So this is a recommendation. It's not absolutely mandatory. I think it's just something that you try out and see how it goes.
Great. And then we have a couple questions here about the size of our office that we have and just how many people, what resources you have. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so this is one of the problems when we were writing the paper. All the stuff we have done here is very IU specific in some sense. So I didn't see someone going out and simply doing this, replicating it, because a lot of things are IU specific. For example, we're highly centralized. That's one thing that a lot of campuses don't have, and it's a big challenge, obviously, out there. So we certainly don't cover all the cases, but there are certain things which are exceptional here. For example, research computing. We have a very large research computing organization. We have 70 or 200 people in there. And normally, most places have 4 or 5. So that helps. We have a lot of research computing, research systems here, which have been made compliant. So pretty much every research system here is subject to our risk management framework. So they have at least 853 controls in place. However, this has taken, again, 10 years to do, so it wasn't something that we did overnight. So that helps a lot. There were also certain pre-existing relationships. For example, when we did the HIPAA program back in the early 2000s, one of the very wise things that my then boss did was said, okay, we're going to do this thing, but we're going to create an oversight committee, and we will do all the work. The committee just has to show up, but we'll put everyone on it that will might later say, oh, you didn't ask us. And that established a bunch of relationships that have basically lasted. So some things just got done sort of right by default, but yes, I mean, I do agree that some of this stuff is very IU specific, so may not apply at your institution. So you'll have to take it and customize it.
And you mentioned those relationships that you had with either a boss, and just to talk a little bit about the support that you can get. Robert asked, what kind of leadership support do you have? Does it go up to the provost? Is it BCR, CIO, chancellor?
Well, I think it's easy to answer that. The two FTEs came from the vice president for research. So that's in fact, like I said, that they were the ones who came up with this. They knew that there was this proposal out there, but that they decided to fund it. So yes, there's support from the top here.
Sounds good. Jim asks here, and let me see, we have a couple here, so forgive me for a second. It says your service model represents a transfer of risk, transfer being one of the 4 common treatments. Does that transfer potentially keep the researcher or human element in the research a highly vulnerable component? Thinking of your encryption example, and given that Verizon typically indicates numbers like 80 to 90% of all HE breaches or security incidents start with socialization threats, failures at the human level, is there a potential for the service to leave that human vulnerability untreated?
Yes, a simple answer. We're not going to change the human nature, obviously, in doing any of this stuff. But there is also not a very good solution. You can provide phishing education and socialization, the typical cybersecurity education that is done. But I think with what we can do, again, as I say, is to make some effort and reduce the risk. The human component is going to remain the most vulnerable component from now till eternity. So there's not much to be said there. But as I said, the way we handle that is once the researcher comes in, we bring them in, and sort of by engaging with them, kind of increase their own security consciousness. Same thing with IT professionals when they come in and work with us. And that's sort of, like on an individual basis, we're doing this. So it's going to take a while, but yeah, your question is quite apt, and unfortunately, the answer is yes. That vulnerability exists still, and researchers are still putting, I'm sure, sensitive data out there. So we have no clue, because there isn't that visibility. The central visibility into research simply doesn't exist. So when there's a breach, that's when you find out. Unfortunately, this is not a surefire recipe for this melody.
Great, and we got a couple more questions here. Is there a white paper about this service? Is that available? Or
Yes,
yeah, there is. I just added it again in the chat, and we got questions about, are slides going to be available? And yes, we'll make those slides available and the recording of this probably in a week or two on the Research SOC YouTube channel. And then CACR will probably share it as well, since it's from Anurag himself. So we will get those resources out to you.
One last thing, and there was one last slide. So ever since we published the paper, we have a great deal of interest in the work that we're doing. And many people have asked us about, potentially helping them with this thing, with standing up their own program and so forth. So what we're doing right now is also to provide help for peers. We are actually going to try to have kind of like a consulting service for other institutions. We're kind of in the process of doing this. This is somewhat problematic because of the load that it puts on us, but there are certain things we can do fairly easily, and then we will add resources as needed as need arises. But for example, establishing cookbook, we have the cookbook is open. I mean, anyone can go and, to look at the use cases and so forth, and essentially customize it for your campus. We can help with that. We can do assessments based on our experience. We can go through talk to people on your campus, find out exactly what's going on and make some recommendations. We can provide training and again, custom consulting, that sort of stuff. So we're kind of slowly thinking about how to do this thing, but we're happy, if you have questions, so we're happy to talk to you, just have an hour-long conversation, not an issue.
We have another question here from Jim. Before the CMMC 1.x to 2.0 debacle, how pressured was your service by the CMMC audit requirements? And were you planning on stepping in front of that and providing coordination? Seems challenging for your FT&V investment.
Yes, absolutely. The thing that's fortunate for us is we don't have a lot of DoD work here. We have a very small number of contracts and even smaller number of contracts with CUI. Obviously, all the contracts have to be at CMMC level 1. And so, yes, we are taking the lead. We're building a CUI, an enclave, for example, in the cloud. And we mean STEP, the Secure My Research, our team is taking that lead because we're the ones who would be providing that support as well. And as far as certification is concerned, it's anyone's guess. In the last couple of days, I had a meeting with some people that are building this, and they said it will take $100,000 to do a single certification. And so if that's the case, I think we're all in deep trouble. So we'll see how that goes, but indeed, it's going to be very challenging.
Great. We have about 3 minutes left. I think we got through all the questions, but if there's anything else, feel free to add it now, and we'll give that a few seconds.
I think I provided. Oh, so let me put this last slide up there just so the coordinates are there. I forgot to. Yeah, you can email me or we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have after this. But as I said, the paper actually goes in a lot of detail. So the things that I've said here, I think are fairly well elucidated in that paper.
Great. I think we'll go ahead and wrap up here. So thanks everyone again for joining, and we will see you next time. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, and bye-bye.